we have to imagine what democracy looks like when it's being run among people whose average income is around $2,000 per year, who worship every day.
You're interested in India, but then the thing that fascinates people is that you have a relatively sympathetic reading of the current Indian government.
Oh, look, I came to the study of India about 7 or 8 years ago with a focus on the economy. My own academic specialty, my own area is development in middle income countries, specifically post-socialist transition economies. And I'd done a lot of work on Russia, a lot of work on China. And I thought, well, India is really growing. Let me start looking at India. I wrote a book chapter on India, a couple of articles related to India, but all about the economy. But I quickly realized that, unlike with Russia and China, my views on the Indian economy were not controversial. I thought the Indian economy was likely to continue growing at least till the late 2030s. And when it reached true middle income status, then we would see what happens. And that just seemed to be a consensus view. So I thought, why continue to write about the economy? What I quickly realized was there was this enormous controversy over Indian democracy. Now, I'm a quants guy. I'm a quantitative sociologist, quantitative comparative sociologist, and there was some very famous work done by Adam Przeworski, a quantitative political scientist, and colleagues in the late 1990s, culminating in a book, I think it was in the year 2000 or 2001, on the quantitative predictors of democratic success. And in all of his models, the models fit pretty well, except for India. There was India sticking out as this massive sore thumb outlier. It should not have been a democracy. It should not have been a democracy in 1947. It should not have remained a democracy through the 20th century, and it should not be a democracy today. So I thought, okay, this has a lot of traction. Like, this is a key question. How do you run a democracy in a poor developing country? India is, and I'm sorry to be so unequivocal, but in this case, it really is true. India is the only major post-colonial country. We can quibble about a few small island states. India is the only major post-colonial country to have remained a democracy from the time of its founding, from the time of its independence until today. Not only that, alone among relatively poor countries, India routinely has competitive elections. Every election in India for the last 50 years has been competitive. In the early years of the Republic, they weren't so competitive. The Congress Party dominated. The last 50 years, they've had extraordinarily competitive elections with routine handovers to opposition parties with no violence and no serious objections. Now, we can debate the quality of Indian democracy. We can debate the current government in India. There's a lot of people upset about the current government in India, led by Narendra Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. But the simple fact of India as having elections that are always competitive, none of these, 98-2 sort of elections with routine handovers of power, that's essentially unique about India, to have such a record. I mean, you have to go to countries, just to go back 40 years, you have to go to countries that are 10 times as rich as India to find a country that has 40 years of routine elections with, handovers of power and competitive elections. So that's what drew me to the study of Indian democracy. It was such a quantitative outlier. Of course, the controversy has been over the quality of Indian democracy, and of course, that's something we're likely to focus on. But the quantity of Indian democracy is the amazing thing that I set out to study.
If we think about the kind of standard Western liberal view of India, I mean, obviously this is a bit of a straw person, but I mean, this seems to be what one hears certainly from Western governments about India very consistently over recent decades. While India was in the hands of the Congress Party, people were very happy to say it was a democracy. And in recent years, as indeed India's got wealthier, so from that point of view, its prospects for democracy ostensibly would be getting better. Yeah. But there's a rhetoric which really is not about the fine-grained quality of Indian democracy, but the idea that the outcome now is undemocratic because they have a leader and a government that is regarded as undemocratic? I think there's possibly two different ways to take this, or two different questions I'd offer you. I mean, one is this kind of question of why it is that Western audiences have this view, but there's also a question of what is actually the case. I mean, is BJP government less democratic or otherwise?
Narendra Modi and the party he leads are unabashedly religious, unabashedly Hindu. That has to be gotten out of the way first. I mean, it is the foremost feature of the BJP that it arises out of a Hindu social movement called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. That is a Hindu lay organization. I would compare it to the Muslim Brotherhood not in ideology, obviously. It's Hindu, Muslim Brotherhood is Muslim, but in structure. It's a national rejuvenation movement that sought to rejuvenate Indian nationhood along Hindu religious lines. That's true. People can argue. Again, you can argue in the details of it, but critics are right when they put that case forward. The question that I think we should be considering as social scientists is that a problem for democracy? We were comfortable with Christian democracy, the Christian democratic parties of Europe. So Germany, the establishment parties of Germany and Italy until the 21st century were the Christian Democrats. We're generally comfortable with a country like Indonesia. We applaud its democracy simply because it is having elections, and yet every party in Indonesia is unabashedly Muslim. The only question is how fundamentalist they are. In fact, the people who are considered the secularists in Indonesia recently declared Sharia law for the country. So, we have to weigh things up. Now, to put it in context, the country that are the party that is the Hindu nationalist party in India, I don't like the term, but the term's routinely applied to it. It applies the term to itself. Hindu nationalist means something different maybe in India than it does internationally, but let's use the term. They use it, so we can use it, I think. The country that's perceived as the Hindu nationalist party in India is an advocate of the Uniform Civil Code. So far from imposing Hindu law on everybody, what they're trying to do is take away Sharia law from Muslims in India. Now, we could construe that as an attack on Islam. And in fact, it has been construed by its critics as an attack on Islam. On the other hand, as small L liberals, and I suspect most reasonable people in Western countries are small L liberals. We believe in human dignity, human freedom, all those small L liberal values. As small L liberals, we want a uniform civil code. We don't want a uniform civil code being put in place by a Hindu party, right? And so we get tied up in knots over this. The struggle with understanding today's India is a struggle with realizing that people who aren't like us can still run a democracy like ours. And I think that's fundamentally the problem that most Westerners and most anti-BJP Indians, who tend to be an internationalized class in India, the problem that everyone seems to have with the BJP and with Narendra Modi. If you don't like the idea of religion in politics, you don't like Indian politics, because India is a religion-suffused country in a way that, frankly, our Western countries have not been for 150 years.
It occurs to me then to ask you, I mean, again, put a little pressure on this point about why Western audiences have this view they have of India. And I want to offer what I think it's kind of a caricature view, but it's a view that one hears not just from Western media, Western academics, but also in my recent experience from, I mean, this seems almost a hegemonic view among Indian academics, actually, to my surprise. It's surprising how hegemonic it is. The view that essentially Modi is a fascist. And therefore, whatever we're seeing in India currently is the death of democracy. No matter what point on this slide, we're perpetually seen as being in India in a kind of 1932, 1933 moment.
I'd like to qualify that claim. You're absolutely right. It's a hegemonic view among academics who have access to Western venues. If you read Indian academics writing in India, there's no such consensus. There's a very strong Hindu nationalist contingent among Indian academics. They're not at the most prestigious universities, they're at the less prestigious universities. There's a strong contingent of BJP supporting academics in the West. They tend to be in business schools, engineering departments, economics faculties. They're not in the social sciences and humanities. Look, I put it to people this way. The RSS is this civil society organization I mentioned. I likened it to the Muslim Brotherhood. They hate that analogy, but it's sociologically true. Their head is a man named Mohan Bhagwat. He's obviously a very conservative Hindu, mainly speaks in Hindi. He can speak English. He's given speeches in English, but of course his milieu is a Hindi milieu, not an English-speaking milieu. And on the other hand, there is the unofficial head of the Congress Party, Rahul Gandhi. He doesn't have an official position within the Congress Party. He's a member of parliament, but other than that, he doesn't have an official position. But as a Gandhi, and that's no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, that's the Feroz Gandhi family, same name but different family. That family has controlled the Congress Party since independence. He's the great grandson of Jawaharlal Nehru, who's India's independence leader. So if we imagine these two people, and we imagine a New York Times editor at a cocktail party in the Hamptons, who is that editor likely to run into? Well, the idea of running into Rahul Gandhi, of course, he jets internationally. He gives speeches at Oxford and at Harvard. He's the sort of person who travels in the circles that you would see at a cocktail party in the Hamptons. The idea that Mohan Bhagwat, a conservative, saffron-wearing, non-drinking vegetarian Hindu, would be at this cocktail party is laughable. He would never be there. With the result that the opinions we tend to get about India, we tend to get from the sort of Indian whose first language is English, who has an international education, who travels frequently, who is equally at home or maybe more at home in the Western mediaverse than in the Indian mediaverse. Well, that kind of person is, of course, welcome to a viewpoint. Everyone's welcome to a viewpoint. But it becomes for us a hegemonic viewpoint because everybody we meet is part of this very thin social class in India. We almost never interact with national intellectuals. So if you watch Indian media, you'll see robust discussions from intellectuals on both sides of these debates. You listen or watch or read Western media, you'll only get that narrow view.
There are today vastly more people of Indian origin in the West than there were even 10 years ago, 20 or 30. It makes me, particularly in the United States, but also in Australia, it makes me wonder how, this ideological hegemon can be maintained so solidly. I mean, I guess you've indicated that, in fact, in some places it's slightly frayed, but you'd expect, for example, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, which is something I know you've been talking about recently elsewhere. I mean, the amount of money that's being given by wealthy Indians, for example, to Western universities. I mean, the Indians who give this money aren't necessarily pro-Congress, but yet somehow this, even though there's this apparent conveyor belt of influence from India, it's somehow still being co-opted by people who have the Congress viewpoint.
You want your name on the building at Stanford or Harvard, you support the faculties at Stanford and Harvard. You can't direct them to hire the people you'd like them to hire. They'll walk away. I mean, we do have academic self-governance, and academic self-governance is self-perpetuating. And the sorts of Indians who would challenge that hegemonic Western view don't end up, generally speaking, being celebrated in these departments. I mean, I'll give you a personal story to make clear just how much policing there is. I've never had a complaint made to the university about me, my teaching, my research, my writing, until 2023. In 2023, the South Asian Studies Academic Collective, I think I have that right, SASAC, a group of scholars associated with SASAC, wrote a letter to the University of Sydney, my university, advocating that I be fired because I was endangering the lives of South Asian studies scholars on account of my criticisms of them in the public sphere. Now, that's bizarre, right? I've challenged lots of people in lots of areas, and academics have fights, and we challenge each other. No one's ever cared enough to try to get me fired, but they do. That is because it is a tight-knit group of people who police their borders very aggressively. So aggressively that even though I'm not applying for a job at Stanford, I'm not applying for a job at Johns Hopkins India Center. They're trying to get me fired from my own job. Now, my university laughed it off. We have very strong protections for academic freedom in Australia in general, and controversially, I'll say this at the University of Sydney in particular. Many of my colleagues don't agree. I do believe we have very strong protections. So the university laughed it off, but it could have become an issue at a different university. That's how strong this policing of boundaries is in relation to India. The people who study India, it's almost a parallel with China. People who study China, actual sinologists. I don't mean people who study the Chinese economy, people who study Chinese abroad. If you're a sinologist, you can count on one hand the number of China critical sinologists. Because if you're critical of the Chinese Communist Party as a sinologist, you lose access to China. You lose access to China originating resources. I mean, China strongly polices access to the sinology community, with the result that the sinology community is, I won't say overwhelmingly pro-CCP. I'll say that they're overwhelmingly non-critical of the CCP. You just don't touch it. Well, with India, there's a similar policing, except it's not being done by the government. It's being done by people who are opposed to the current government in India, and it's much more aggressive.
It seems to me that something that's really helped this is the extent to which these views about Modi have dovetailed with views in the West about what's happening in Western politics. So that people who don't really know much about India, it's very easy to present. You go, well, this guy Trump you don't like, who's a fascist. Modi, he's the guy, he's the Trump in India. And of course, there's very significant dissimilarities here. I mean, actually, I want to open this to discussion more broadly, which might interest you sociologically, about the extent to which we can think of the BJP within this concept of populism that's now been bandied around to talk about, Trump, Brexit, or et cetera, et cetera.
Populist, but also overtly nationalist. And I think the parallel between Modi and the BJP and Trump's faction of the Republican Party is the overt, unapologetic nationalism. Again, few Westerners realize that overt, unapologetic nationalism is absolutely characteristic of Indian politics. I mean, there's, the Congress is overtly, national is in the middle name of the Indian National Congress, but also if you look at their website, they say we are a nationalist party. In India, you can't get elected unless you sing the national song, hand over art. There's no taking the knee with the Indian national anthem. You would be cut from politics forever if you did that. So overt nationalism is something that characterizes all political parties in India, but the BJP is much more jingoistic than the Congress or than other parties. There are a few parties that are even more jingoistic than the BJP. India is a multi-party system. No party ever gets a majority in India. Everything is plurality. BJP has never won a majority. I just want to be clear, their vote share has hovered in the low 40% range in the last two national elections. So that nationalism combined with populism is something that many intellectuals condemn, shy away from, find an anathema. That's very much true. I don't personally find populism a dirty word. I think that populism is an important way, important movement for sweeping away old institutions. And of course, old institutions aren't happy about being swept away. Populism, on the other hand, rarely has a positive program. So the idea that the whole term fascist populism is an oxymoron, right? You can't use populist methods to install a command and control system that's highly centralized where people obey. The very nature of populism is that people are upset about something. They're angry about something. They're trying to sweep away something they don't like. That's why Trumpism in politics never resulted in Trumpism in institutions. Trump had 4 years. He may get another 4 years. The institutions are not going to change dramatically because populism doesn't have a program of institution building. It has a program of institution destruction. And sometimes institutions have to be destroyed. It was a populist wave that swept aside slavery in the United States. We tend to forget that. It was a populist wave that swept aside the big monopolies in the United States. So populism is something that can flush out an old and many people might think decayed or dysfunctional political system. What replaces it is anybody's guess.
So from this point of view, though, surely we can't characterize the BJP as populist.
Well, so I've actually recently, I've recently written and spoken about this, that after 10 years and symbolically, there was one of the BJP's major goals was to open a temple of Ram at Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh. They got not only did they get their temple, they had Narendra Modi breathe life into the murti, into the idol. Now, that symbolically, to me, meant, no, you're the establishment now. So a constant, I'd say the fairest criticism of the BJP is they've consistently governed as if they were an opposition party. Criticizing the establishment. We're going to tear down the establishment. We can't allow the establishment. And I started writing last month, well, wait a minute, you are the establishment now, right? So now is the time for them to present a positive program of institution building as opposed to their 10-year program of tearing down institutions. They've been very successful at tearing down institutions. They haven't really replaced them with new ones. Now, when I say institutions, I don't mean organizations. They haven't torn apart the Indian government. What they've done is they've torn down the previous assumptions on which Indian politics were based, but they haven't presented a new positive vision for India, and I think that's incumbent on them to do so. Let me give a specific example again. The BJP, in a country that is 15% Muslim, India is 80% Hindu, we tend to forget, we think because Indians in America or in Australia tend to, if they're Hindu Indians, they tend to integrate as Indian Australians or Indian Americans. If they're Muslim Indian, they tend to integrate as Muslim Australians or Muslim Americans. Right? So Muslims tend not to retain their Indian national identity when they move to a new country. So we tend to think of Indians as Hindus. But of course, Hindus are 80% of the population in India. Muslims are around 15%. And then Christians and various other religions account for the remaining 5%. In a country that's 15% Muslim, there's not a single BJP member of parliament who is Muslim. Now, BJP spokespeople say, well, that's not our problem. There are a bunch of Muslim political parties. The Indian National Congress runs Muslim candidates. There are Muslims in the Lok Sabha. There are more Muslims in the Lok Sabha than there were before the BJP came to power. The odds aren't necessarily stacked against Muslims. That claim is, I think, false. But the BJP is not acting like a responsible establishment party. That is, it hasn't taken ownership of the country and said, you know what, we can win more votes if we run Hindu candidates, but it's important for us as a national institution to represent the diversity of India as a country. And thus, we should be running Muslim candidates, even if they're not as electorally successful. Now, I think it's become incumbent on the BJP to start behaving like an establishment party. That is, it should take responsibility for Muslim social advancement. Its position is, that's none of our business. All Indians are equal. We'll run who we want. Muslims can run their candidates. We won't interfere. It's a fair playing field. There's a logic to their position, but there's not a heart to their position, right? So these are the sorts of debates we have there. No one reasonably suggests that Muslim candidates are systematically prevented from running in India. And like I said, there are more Muslim MPs now than there were 10 years ago. But if the BJP is the new establishment and it's setting the institutional framework within which the country operates, it's their responsibility now to do more to foster Muslim social inclusion in India. And they don't want that responsibility. I think it's up to them to step up to the plate.
But I mean, is there an extent to which we can say that, and obviously the position you're taking is the BJP is a new establishment, but they have an opposition attitude
Yeah.
because there's still an establishment which they don't control. So the legal establishment, for example, the cultural elites and so on. And I mean, and I'd like to just before you answer, draw an analogy with the United States, where it's very clear with Trump, as you already said. I mean, he had 4 years in the White House, but he never even really controlled his own party, let alone actually controlling the organs of state. So he oddly remained insurgent and populist and railing against things that he seemed unable to control even from the highest office. So is the BJP situation a bit similar to that still, or has it changed?
I would say no, in that internationally, the BJP's situation is similar. The Deutsche Welle will condemn Modi just as it would condemn Trump. But the Deutsche Welle doesn't matter in Indian politics. Within India itself, I would say of the major news organizations, they now slant BJP. I think the criticisms that, oh, the news media have been taken over by right wingers, that's overblown. But the news media that 10 years ago would have been 80% anti-BJP is now 60% pro-BJP. Right. So the news world has adjusted to the fact that the BJP is the new establishment power. In Indian academia, okay, the major national associations may still be controlled, like the Indian Sociological Association, the Indian Political Science Association may still be controlled by the old establishment. But there's no shortage of pro-BJP, pro-Hindu nationalist academics who are at reasonably prestigious universities, some even at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Of course, the BJP, since JNU, the premier university in India, is a national university, the BJP took the opportunity to appoint its own vice chancellor. So the vice chancellor is a political appointee. There's no other way to say it, of the BJP. Now, it had previously been a political appointee of the old establishment. So, I don't believe in vice chancellors being political appointees, but in the Indian system, vice chancellors are political appointees. That's just the reality of the system. So, within India, major establishment events now tend to be not jingoistically celebrating Narendra Modi and the BJP, but majority, I think a fair analyst has to say that they're now majority representing the BJP point of view. Now, for the rabid Twitter activists of the who are strongly the Modi Bhakts, Modi devotees, as they're called. But I've been accused of being a Modi Bhakt. I've made jokes about it. But for the true Modi Bhakts on Twitter, 60% is not enough. If there's one person who maligns Narendra Modi in any way, that person must be driven off any institution in India. But they don't call the shots. They don't control the institutions. But yeah, India, the BJP, although it's not perceived as the establishment outside India, it's become the establishment in India. Not to the same extent that Congress was 50 years ago, but very, very clearly so.
We haven't tackled directly the things people adduce to say that the BJP is fascist or Modi is fascist. The question of Modi's own biography, because the big thing that's said about Modi is that he presided over and deliberately assisted communal riots in which lots of Muslims were.
He did preside over them. There's no dispute there. Look, so let's put fascism in a box, because fascism is a generic internet insult. Serious media, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the Australian, Times of London, don't call India a fascist regime. It's a generic political insult, and there's nothing akin to fascism. The RSS, call them brown shirts if you want, because they tend to wear brown, khaki actually, but they've never been armed. They've never been seriously accused of participating in violent action. So, let's leave fascism aside. But take on that more serious issue. So first, Hindu pogroms against Muslims. The last major, large-scale, I mean, there's always intercommunal violence in India, but the last large-scale intercommunal violence was while Mr. Modi was chief minister of Gujarat. And I'm sorry, I didn't prep it. I believe it was 2001 or 3. I'm sorry, I didn't prep for this. Early 2000s. He was chief minister. There was a train full of Hindu pilgrims returning from Ayodhya, that place we mentioned, from the Ram temple site that they wanted to build there, coming back to Pune. I'm sorry, Gujarat, coming back to Gujarat from Ayodhya. That train was firebombed. Now, there's some debate, did it catch fire organically? But I think the general consensus is it was firebombed. More than 50 Hindu pilgrims died in that bombing. There was a lot of ill feeling around the Ayodhya site. I mean, to put it in context, a Hindu mob had torn down the mosque in Ayodhya. This was not a civil issue. After the Hindu pilgrims died in this conflagration in a train, there was a Hindu anti-Muslim pogrom in the towns. That then led to Muslim violence. The estimates are that more Muslims were killed than Hindus, but violence on both sides. And Mr. Modi seemed to view it as not his problem. Right. And that's the chief charge. The chief charge is that as chief minister of Gujarat, he did not forcefully step in to end the violence. He instructed his police forces to stop violence. He called for central government assistance. The central government refused to provide it. So for whatever political reasons, the central government didn't want to get involved and essentially said, that's your problem in Gujarat. But he did not effectively quell the violence. He had only been chief minister for 1 month. He had never held a political leadership position before. He'd spent his entire life within the RSS as a activist within the RSS. My own guess, and clearly I'm not an expert on this, you'll see from the hesitation from which I'm recalling facts, but my own guess is that he simply didn't have the competence to do it. And people bristle at that because they say, Mr. Modi's the most competent prime minister India's ever had. And I say, yeah, but this was his first job, right? He may be competent now. Was he competent 20, 25 years ago in his first job, in his first month on the job? And my instinct is he simply didn't understand that as a political leader, you have to be a community leader. You have to go out to the community and say, please stay home, stop this violence. He left it to the police. The police were overwhelmed and the violence happened. Now, I've seen no credible allegations that he stoked the violence. All the allegations of that are hearsay. So the main allegation comes from the British Embassy and British Foreign Service papers, where people who were known to the British Embassy had heard that Narendra Modi ordered, they weren't there in the room, but they'd heard on the street that Modi had ordered the violence. I think that's a very weak bit of evidence. That said, he bears command responsibility for the violence. I don't think, there have been multiple investigations in India, investigations conducted by the Supreme Court of India, which is a fully independent body. And in any case, the Supreme Court was under Congress. This was under Congress administration. India's Supreme Court absolved Modi of responsibility. Well, either we put trust in the institutions or we don't. But this was a serious blot on his record. I mean, there's no way around it. It was a terrible thing that happened while he was in charge, and he should have taken care of it. But did he organize a retribution on the Muslim community? The evidence of that is secondhand hearsay.
Circling back around to the thing you said right at the beginning of your response, then, if we talk about the signifier fascist, I mean, it's simply something you want to bracket from discussion because it's too pejorative. It seemed to be what you were suggesting before. Or can we say there's kind of...
It's not that it's pejorative, it's analytically meanishless. Now, by the way, the riots were 2002. So when I was saying 2001, 2003, I was bracketing
right in the middle.
2002 was the violence. Look, if fascism means something, it means something in context of the Italian fascist party, the Nazis, who were widely viewed as the archetype of fascism. And in political theory, an older political theory, if you go back to Hannah Arendt, today these terms have really become obfuscated. If you go back to Hannah Arendt and the early theory of fascism, fascism is a system where a party controls all of the institutions of society. So it's a strong party system in which the party runs your daycare center, the party runs the churches, the party runs the industry association. The party runs, so that there's no independent civil society because the party has infused civil society. Now, some people may claim that the RSS, through its vast network of organizations, has done that in India. The problem with that is that the RSS has its own trade union, but it's not the dominant trade union. The main trade union is an anti-RSS trade union. The RSS has its own industry confederation, but it's not the main industry confederation. The Indian Confederation of Industry is the main. So there's not that complete control over civil society in India that is archetypical of a fascist system. When people say India is fascist, they simply mean, I don't like those right-wing people who are in government. In the same way as calling Trump a fascist. I mean, Trump may be many bad things. We can call Trump a populist. We can call him, we can even call him autocratic in governance style. We can call him all sorts of things, potty mouth if you want, but we can't call him a fascist because he doesn't control a fascist party that has control over institutions. I'm more concerned with serious political scientists who don't call India fascist. They call India autocratic. So the Bharatiya Democracy Institute in Sweden is the chief democracy measurement body in the world in academic political science. They call India an electoral autocracy, and they make it a parallel to China's unelected autocracy. And that sounds very powerful. Autocracy. What does autocracy mean? Look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It means one person rule, a dictator, essentially. One person makes decisions that others must implement. But that's not what how VDEM measures autocracy. VDEM calls India an autocracy because it's fallen below a certain threshold. I forget the number, but they have a score that runs from 0 to 1. And if you fall below 0.7, you transition from being an imperfect democracy to being an electoral autocracy. Well, to me, that doesn't justify the use of the word. That simply says the democracy is not of a quality that you endorse. But autocracy is not democracy, right? Autocracy is one-person rule. India clearly doesn't have one-person rule. But political scientists routinely use that word autocracy because VDEM uses it. And VDEM uses it because India now has whatever, 69.9 instead of 70.1 on it. I'm making up the number, but it's a threshold number that India's fallen below on their index.
Yeah, I mean, you're a quantitative sociologist, you said, but I mean, I find it's just suggesting it's a binary, not a quantitative issue. This is it's discrete whether you are or are not.
Look, I think it should be binary qualitatively. If we use the words like fascist or autocracy or authoritarian, to my view, that should mean a quality of party system. Not those shouldn't be used to describe score ranges on a democracy index.
Yeah,
but political science has gone that direction, and
well, it's an attempt to make everything quantitative, I suppose.
Well, there's nothing wrong with quantifying things. The problem is using these terms. So if they were to use the term high quality democracy, medium quality democracy, low quality democracy, non-democracy, fine, I would have no quibble. But a perceived, now I don't agree with their assessment that India is a low quality democracy, but the perception that India is a low quality democracy is not the same thing as being an autocracy. Yet they simply use the label for a democracy that falls below a threshold.
I mean, I'm still playing devil's advocate a bit here, and I'm sorry if it's getting irritating. I'm continuing to press on this, but I guess that the alternative account of what's happening here is that the BJP is waiting for a moment when it will, actually become, its Hindu supremacism will come full blast, and it will start at that point genuinely oppressing, Muslims organizing pogroms and the like. That currently they don't have the juice to do it, but this is what they really want. Would that make? I mean, obviously it's highly speculative, but I mean, this
we all speculate our opponents that way. I mean, the Indian National Congress, when it had a supermajority, did in fact outlaw opposition parties, jailed members of the RSS, the BJP's parent organization, declared a state of emergency, suspended elections, suspended civil liberties, implemented a program of forced sterilization, nationalized industries, and pushed through major changes to the Indian Constitution, including The Indian constitutional amendment that limited free speech in India was passed by Nehru when he controlled the country and before India held its first elections. Then in 1975-77 is when all those other things happened, the emergency. Under his daughter, Indira Gandhi, and power was passed down from father to daughter to grandson and now to prospectively great-grandson. So like if I wanted to build an image of a dictatorial party that once it gets into power will take over, India, give everything to its friends, repress civil liberties, and become a dictatorship. Well, the Congress has that history. Now, I don't believe Congress today would do that any more than I believe the BJP would do that. And the reason is that India has a very strong civil society. I mean, why do democracies survive? Well, lots of democracies have people who would be dictators if they could, but when you have a very strong network of civil society organizations, that prevents these things from happening. I think it's India's strong civil society that prevented a descent into dictatorship in 1975-77 and that forced a return to elections. And I think that strong civil society would prevent a BJP dictatorship today, just as it would prevent a return of Congress dictatorship. To me, it's about the society, not about the political party and its aspirations. And the BJP, obviously, like any political party, would stay in power forever. I mean, it's never going to say, we've had 3 elections, it's your turn now. No political party says that. But it will eventually be voted out, and all indications are that when it's voted out, it'll leave. I mean, it's done so at the state level. In states where it's fought hard and then lost an election, it bows out, and it's routinely done so, as has every other political party in India consistently at every election since 1950.
I'd like to actually ask about the kind of economic dimension of what's been happening in India. And I mean, specifically more like the political economic dimension. I mean, one thing you said right at the beginning is that you interest before you got interested in India, or how you got interested in India, was democracies in transition. And it occurred to me when you said that India has kind of gone through a transition, in a different way, but in parallel with both Russia and China, because it had very, I don't know, what should we say, socialist, non-market.
It had a planned
aspects.
Economy.
Yeah. And it's come out of that. I mean, to what extent because this is another possible reading of the BJP, particularly from a kind of Marxist point of view, would be to say the BJP really is the neoliberal party. And that's, I mean, not that Congress isn't neoliberal, but that's what the modern BJP is. Okay, it's you've got this, saffron garb, but really it's about neoliberalism.
There's some truth in that, but not much truth in that the BJP has been very slow to reform the economy. They present themselves as a reformist party, but they pulled back from liberalization of agriculture in the face of major demonstrations. They listed the Life Insurance Company of India, the largest financial organization in India. They listed it on the stock market, but with a minority listing, it's still majority state-owned. Steel industry is still in state hands. Defense industry is still in state hands. They have been privatization light, which is to say that privatization and liberal economics and neoliberal economics are part of the BJP's policy heritage, but they're a very low priority for the BJP. The BJP is primarily a Hindu cultural party. And if they had to choose between, privatizing the railways or consecrating a temple to Lord Ram on a former mosque site, the temple comes first, right? It's an absolute policy priority. The railway reform is a minor issue for them. Now, that said, look, a lot of people listening will believe in state planning. I'll put my cards on the table. My own view is that pro-poor policies are necessary for economic growth, and that state planning is rarely pro-poor. So my own view, other people do believe that the state can efficiently and effectively run industries. If you believe that, then no political party is for you, because today's economic reform process in India was kicked off by the Congress Party in 1991. So both there's a broad consensus in India around slow, measured economic liberalization. And that's been a cross-party consensus ever since 1991. No party is going to change that. Even the Communist Party in Kerala has bought into a slow reform process. it's just the direction India is going, whether people like it or not. There's just a near universal party consensus around slow but steady economic liberalization.
It's very enlightening.
Well,
Well,
that's why I said it was non-controversial, which was why I bowed out of the field. There was no point writing a book about, why slow, sensible liberalization is the best way forward for India when everybody's doing that already.
and it's a success. I mean, this is another question that I guess come up a little bit, the kind of question of, well, India has seen dramatic economic growth, but on the other hand, it's lagged behind China. So there's a kind of avenue of criticism there that India's not.
Yeah, India started 10 years after China, and India's reform process has been much slower than China's, with the result that today India is behind China about 15 years in GDP per capita. If you go to Delhi today, you'll recognize Beijing Olympics 2008. Everything's a construction site. Metro is expanding from 7 lines to 15 lines. It's right at that China 2000. India 2023 was the China 2008 moment. That said, critics will point out correctly that unemployment has been rising in India. There's been difficulty in cities absorbing rising number of immigrants to cities. There are two sides to that coin. So, if you're a positive-minded person, employment has been growing in India rapidly. If you're a negative-minded person, it has been growing rapidly as the demand for formal sector jobs. But there are more and more formal sector jobs. Is that a good thing? Personally, I view transition from subsistence or near subsistence agricultural employment to formal sector employment. I view that as a progressive, as a positive change. But there are many people who view you have an ideal, and including Gandhi himself, of the yeoman farmer, who owns his or her own land. Well, then that's a negative. There are legitimate differences of view on what the goal should be. But if the goal is GDP growth, not everyone accepts that goal. If the goal is GDP growth, then yes, India is succeeding. But I stress it would be succeeding under any party. The advocates of the BJP love to point to the growth. And I said, well, India grew faster in the 10 years previous under Congress than in the 10 years. They said, oh, what about COVID? I said, well, what about the global financial crisis? They said, well, what about all the rail track that's being built now? It took them 6 months to build this much rail, and now it's being done in 6 weeks. And I say, yes, but India is much more developed now, much more able to build rail than it was 10 years ago, right? So the simple fact is there's a cross-party consensus on this. Those who want to return to a village India are just bound to be disappointed. That's not to say it's wrong. It's to say that no major political force in India is promoting that.
Right. I mean, so it really does make India sound like a boring Western-style liberal democracy from this point of view, where it doesn't make that much difference who's in power.
If I could give a takeaway, the best way to understand Indian democracy is Western-style liberal democracy operating in a society that is very poor and very religious. If you don't embrace a religious message, you cannot get elected in India.
That's true even of Congress politicians.
Everybody's really. It's a matter of how overt they are. But there's been a major controversy of a regional leader in Tamil Nadu who has said, Hindu background, atheist, who said that the Hindu faith is all religions, including the Hindu religion, are a bundle of lies. Typical religion is the opiate of the masses sort of rhetoric, and the whole country has come down on him, like a ton of bricks, because you just don't say that in a country where more than 90% of people pray every day. Well, we can't imagine running politics in an environment where 90% of people pray every day, where the majority of people have a shrine. I mean, we can imagine a Mexican peasant family having a shrine in the corner to the Virgin Mary. Well, having a shrine to Shiva or Ganesh, or to having a shrine or to your own ancestors in the corner of your living room, that's absolutely standard in India. Nearly everybody, nearly all Hindus do. Muslims, of course, don't, but Muslims have their own attachment to religion. We have to imagine running what democracy looks like when it's being run among people whose average income is around $2,000 per year, who worship every day. And that's going to look different from running a democracy in a place where the average income is $70,000 a year and people maybe worship once or twice a year.
Okay, that's a good takeaway. It's a good point to leave it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights into the situation.
I know we're wrapping up, Mark.
Yeah,
Can I
sure.
make that even more unequivocal?
Yeah.
I'm a free speech absolutist. And freedom of speech means letting people speak their minds. In a country where 80% of the population is secular, most of the speech we see is going to be secular. In a country that is overwhelmingly religious, most of the speech we hear is going to be religious. If we believe in letting people speak their minds, we're going to get a different outcome in India than we get in Australia or the United States. And if we're committed to that basic liberal principle, we have to accept that. That's what respecting the individual means. It means respecting what the individual wants, for what individuals want for themselves, not what we want for them. I'm not a conservative Hindu Indian. It's not my preference. But I respect people who are, just as much as I respect conservative Indian Muslims, just as much as I respect conservative Indian Sikhs, as much as I respect the small number of very brave atheists in India, who are, willing to say, I respect all of their right to freedom. But we have to accept that if we respect everybody's right to speak, then most of the speech in India will look very different from most of the speech in Australia.